Well, hello, Cairo. Pleased to be here with you virtually this evening. I'll be speaking about modern least privilege in the context of DevSecOps. I believe it is appropriate, given this is DevOps Days, to talk a little bit about how security fits in within DevOps and where we've been, where are we going. As means of introduction, my name is Andres Vega. I am Vice President of Operations at a global security consultancy called Control Plane. In addition to my job, I'm very involved in the open source community. I am one of the security technical leaders for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. You may know the CNCF from projects such as Kubernetes, etcd, Spiffy. Spiffy is a project I'm very much involved. Spiffy Inspire, I am in the steering committee, helping drive the direction of the project, helping organizations build secure by default, modern, resilient web applications utilizing zero trust architectures. I have written a few things. I'd encourage you, if you're not familiar with any of these publications, to check them out. Under the CNCF, we published in the last year a paper on software supply chain best practices. And as a follow-up, we also wrote a reference architecture implementing those best practices into what we call the Secure Software Factory. Recently, just in the last week, myself and another 7 co-authors wrote a book for IT Revolution called Investments Unlimited. Talk a little bit more about the book in a minute. It is part of the series of the Phoenix Project, the Unicorn Project, the seminal DevOps publications. I've also helped out with a number of security audits for open source projects, namely Spiffy Inspire, Harbor as the container registry, artifact registry, and also Cloud Native build packs. Control Plane, in addition to security consulting, does a lot of training and education, primarily around Kubernetes security. If that's something you're interested in, I'd encourage you to check out our website, controlplane.io. Cool. So let's carry on. The book, if it caught your attention, it just published the last week, very much in the vein of the Phoenix Project and the Unicorn Project. If you remember the Phoenix Project, it's the story of a manufacturing organization, retail organization, going through a digital transformation. In this day and age, we felt that it'd be appropriate, given that a lot of highly regulated organizations, namely financial institutions, are going through the same paradigm shift, to narrate the story of a financial institution coming to terms with how to do security differently, how to apply DevOps and incorporate security within software delivery. We introduce concepts, tools, and ideas that reimagine governance in a modern digital age, all in the pursuit of developer productivity and operational efficiency. Great. So how does that translate to the rest of us? How does that resonate or could be applied in your jobs or in the context of Egypt and the region and what you do day to day? I think it's important to pause for a second. We talk a lot about where things are going, what is going to change, what is the next thing we should be learning on. But very rarely we stop to ask ourselves, what's not going to change? On screen, you see one of my favorite quotes. This is from Jeff Bezos. He often gets the question of what is going to change, but rarely, almost no one asks what's not going to change in the next 10 years. So what things should we paying attention and investing on that we know are going to be a constant? Before we get into what's not changing, the change that we see rapidly evolving is the notion of platform engineering. That is DevOps teams. DevOps teams that are not strictly application developers. They're not strictly they're not strictly infrastructure operations. We see that they are right in the middle as enablers of the software delivery pipeline for the entire business. And as of recent, cybersecurity becoming a top-level concern for the business, we are seeing a lot of security shift left, and a lot of the responsibilities that were traditionally the responsibility of information security now fall in the hands of DevOps and DevSecOps and platform engineering. It is very important, and this words, I am paraphrasing Andrew Clay Schaefer, is it's not that just your platform engineer, in addition to having to care about performance, availability, reliability, that they should also now be security experts. It means that these teams should be working closer together with the security team. Security is evolving to be a big part and to be ingrained into the software development lifecycle. And at the same time, we are seeing, as we see it in this conference, we see it in this space, we're evolving together as a global community, sharing best practices. So what has worked for us can be applied to others, and we can shorten those learning curves and do more faster, more securely. I hope that makes sense so far. I hope it's not disagreeing or opposite to the observations you may have seen. So now let's talk about what's not changing. What's not changing is there's no such thing as secure software. This is a great cartoon that easily explains the tension we see even within security teams. You have an offensive security team, also known as red team. You have a defensive team, known as blue team, that their interests are often at odds, and they're playing constant catch-up with each other. It is a fact that software is vulnerable. All new software is going to include vulnerabilities. So we have to reassess, how is it now that it's becoming also a responsibility of platform engineering, that we can do security differently, that we can do security better. Some of the issues, some of the tensions that exist within security teams are, once again, new software is prone to have new vulnerabilities. New vulnerabilities don't necessarily mean that the code is exploitable. It just has the likelihood that it can be exploited. So we should recognize that in order to have better compensating controls, better defenses, better mitigation, better processes around what are security objectives and how do we operate safely and securely. Now, as you're shipping software, it is a common practice, it's become a common practice to scan software for vulnerabilities. And those results are often variable depending on the scanner that you use. You're going to have a lot of false positives. You're going to have different results from different scanning vendors. And it's often hard to reason. And you're going to hear from your vendors, oh, trust us. We have analyzed this code. And even though your scanner is giving you alerts and alarms, this code is safe. But how can you really tell? We're seeing the concept of bills of materials, software bills of materials, abbreviated as SBOM, as a declaration from the vendor saying, hey, here are all the input sources that have made it into this artifact, so you know what's in it. But that gives us a recipe. And there's often trust issues around the fidelity and the verity of those bills of materials. We go back to late 2021, December. The software world was shaken by the Log4Shell vulnerability, and security teams across companies were struggling to know, is our software affected or is it not? So we come to terms, all software is vulnerable. What ways should teams start thinking about security? in order to do, once again, do different, do better, since what we've been doing hasn't given us better results until date. Not all is bad news. If we see this gentleman in the picture, Brian Kernigan, maintainer Rock, has been for decades maintaining the code, testing it, still patching it. We see onslaught stream of new software with new features, and we see a lot of more open source innovating rapidly. So the importance of having hygiene to drive adoption, to drive growth, is very critical, to understand that we can do better if we commit to supporting, maintaining, and just following basic hygiene practices around the software. And we're going to look at what some of those practices are. We don't want to have incidents that are reactionary, that are reactive, and suddenly everyone in the company is patching and mitigating issues. We want to start doing better proactive security as opposed to panicking every time something like Log4Shell happens. Once again, software is vulnerable. Here's a list of all software that is known to be vulnerable. We're talking about open source applications, open source libraries, compiled libraries, binary artifacts, the software you've bought from the large organizations, the software that runs in the cloud providers we've trusted with, your operating system, the bash script that is running in production, and all of the things software related. So what software is not vulnerable is something to once again tell ourselves over and over again. What's the big deal with it? Well, vulnerable software can and will lead to breaches, to remote code execution, exfiltration of data, secrets getting exfiltrated and reutilized, lateral moves, malware implants, more and more compromised software as these lateral moves permeate, and the worst case scenario, advanced persistent threats. Here's as means of reference to give concrete examples, software that is out there known to chronically be insecure and often exploited, often taken advantage of. So painted a dire, a dark picture in the reality, but what are the options really? Are we just going to accept the fact and do nothing and stop deploying and go home? Not really a great option. So there is a path forward of all of us collectively getting our act together. And in the day and age of cloud and the day and age of dynamically scheduled, elastically scaled infrastructure and applications, there's a path of what folks often refer to as the 3 R's. That is repair, repave, and rotate. Repair vulnerable software as soon as updates are available, API driven, done programmatically. As soon as we know that there's a patch available, do not wait. Roll it out. Repave infrastructure and applications from a good known state and do it often. We're talking about immutable, ephemeral, just no snowflakes, repave every single time your infrastructure, roll it out, make sure there's no drift, make sure there's no deviation. And C, rotate system credentials. Talk about this one specifically in a little bit more detail, but move away from hard-coded credentials, shared secrets, embedding your API keys and software. You want to put in place short-lived cryptographic identities that are only used for short periods of time. Could be an hour, 10 minutes, 5 minutes. But if a credential is to be exfiltrated, that minimizes the risk of that being utilized against you because it had a utility time. It had a very short time to live. Here's one more observation that is important to bring into consideration as we start to do the 3 Rs. And here's where we start talking about least privilege. From the last decade, we've seen applications evolve and we've seen environments evolve. Traditionally, we had in on-premise data centers a strong notion of a perimeter. There was a boundary between the company, the applications within the company, and the outside world. And traffic patterns were fairly predictable, north-south. There was some east-west movement within the data center, but all behind the firewall. And you'd have a demarcation point, a DMZ, a demilitarized zone as your proxy in between. As applications started to migrate to the cloud, that hard wall disappeared. It evaporated. And the cloud, the reality is there's no perimeters. There is applications that are composed by much larger number of smaller services, and those services may run across different environments, different regions, different cloud providers. We see a trend of bring your own device within organizations, people using their tablets, using their computers. Really hard to predict the pattern and the lines of communication between one endpoint and another. So firewalls and perimeter-driven security no longer scales. We need to move to point-to-point, mutual transport layer security, zero trust architectures in order to do differently. So I talk about least privilege, and this is not a new concept. The notion of least privilege has been published in writing going as far back as 1974. Once again, least privilege is every program and every privileged user of the system should operate using the least amount of privilege necessary to complete the job, and no more. We're talking here about blocking all traffic and all communications unless it is explicitly allowed. Moving away from deny lists to allow lists, and ensuring that it is short-lived and those credentials are given just in time for the operation and they're not reused. These programs, if we do the 3 Rs, are repaired often, redeployed from last known state, and the credentials are used once or for a very short period of time necessary to complete that operation between one service and the other. We are looking at a new world. We must restate how we've been doing security. We've seen, as we're taking more as a platform team, as DevOps teams, the responsibility to do security, we realize how hard this has been, how much of a full-time job for large security teams and for application developers to write libraries for authentication, authorization, for scanning, for signing and verifying. So a lot of those different security functions, we have started to move and make those part of the platform with it when itself. We need to grow the interfaces to consume the security functions programmatically. We cannot do that alone. We need to ensure that as platform teams working with developers and operations, we're also bringing security for their knowledge and expertise, for their considerations, and for ours. Combining that collective of multiple perspectives will enable better results. It is very important that as we implement the notion of least privilege, we don't do it using shared credentials or proof of possession, that we do that using strong, unique, granular identities. People talk a lot about zero trust. If zero trust is a concept that is new to you, you can reach out to me after this conversation. Happy to provide resources, happy to have the conversation, do a lot of more education. I presume you may be familiar with a lot of it, but as people talk about doing zero trust starts with identities. It is foundational. Not talking about user identities alone, talking about machine identities, talking about service identities, ensuring that every single component, if I go back in the picture, every single box here, every single container or sets of containers that make up these services has a unique cryptographic verifiable identity. So we can understand the components, we can understand the actors, the relationships, the set of events, and in turn, we can enforce authorization using that least privilege notion. If moving forward and you're saying, yes, we're doing DevSecOps, once again, in order to do DevSecOps and do it to meet the demands and requirements of rapidly deployed software with really high rates of refactoring, really high rates of fluctuation, you must do the 3 R's. You must repair all vulnerable software as soon as updates are available. You must repave servers and applications from a good known state and do it as often as practically possible. And rotate system credentials frequently, ideally as close to a value of 0, so they're only used for a period of time, and those credentials in turn have no utility. If we go back and once again, if we've seen a lot of breaches of large companies in recent times, if you look at the attack chain, the attack typically started off a compromised credential. And then there was a lateral move. Someone got a hold of a user credential or a system credential, and that's how we're able to enter the system. With that, if we don't do this right, here's a graphic, here's a picture. Hopefully the connection is good and you can see it come across. This is a picture of what happens when the supply chain goes wrong, when production security goes wrong, everything falls apart. And it's really hard to pick up the pieces from there on. With that, I conclude my keynote talk. I would love to be in person and have joined you for DevOps Days. Unfortunately, wasn't able to be there in person. Nonetheless, it is a great honor and privilege to have been invited to be part of the series of talks. I am available online. Feel free to connect with me.